they all have their name tags.
Yes, this is great. Thank you. So I know you don't have my slides today, so hopefully you'll hang in there and just listen with me. I try not, my slides are not too text heavy to begin with. So we'll send them to you afterwards, and maybe the pictures will help jog your memory. But this is really intended to be a very high-level overview of knowledge translation, so that as you're carrying out your research over the next couple years, and in your clinical work, you can sort of have these ideas and principles in mind. And we're just barely sort of scratching the surface of this pretty exciting and fairly new scholarly field. So I go by Kate, and I'm the Associate Director of Knowledge Translation here at the Center for Healthcare Innovation. My primary faculty appointment is in Community Health Sciences at U of M, and I hold a research chair in knowledge translation. So I study how research gets put into practice, and it's something that I'm really excited about and always sort of happy to share with the world. So hopefully maybe we'll plant some seeds today in you guys, and you might find that this area and way of thinking resonates with you. So I'll talk a little bit about how I got into doing knowledge translation research. I would say is sort of a second academic career for me, which for a lot of researchers it is. I think when you're coming at it from a clinical perspective, you can bring almost a different spin to it, or you will probably identify more inherently with the issues that I'm talking about today, in contrast if I was to go talk to a class of med-micro students, for example. Then we'll talk a little bit about what knowledge translation is and why we need to do about it, why we need to do it and focus on it. And then what I will finish off with is giving you a case example from my research that has nothing to do with children just yet, but hopefully what it can show you is how this could be applied to a different topic area that you guys might be interested in. So my take-home message for today is that, and what I would like you to sort of keep in mind is the idea of integrating knowledge translation into a health research program is about beginning with the end in mind. So if you have thought a bit about these concepts at all yet, often when I talk to researchers, they only think about knowledge translation at the end. Okay, now I've done the research, now how do I get it out there? But for me, where it gets really powerful and where it has the potential for the most impact is it is informing the research design. It's informing the very research questions that you're asking in a practical and usable way, so that when you get to the end, you're more likely to have your users be able to adopt and use the research that you're doing. And so with that in mind, I sort of tend to say that it's a long-term research approach. It's a paradigm, it's a way of doing research. But if you take that perspective, it's one that you can apply across many, even potentially most research programs. And I think at the sort of nexus of research and clinical practice that you guys will likely be working in, this could apply very well. Again, when I'm talking to basic researchers, this is getting much more out of their comfort zone than they're sort of traditionally applied to. So my own personal story, how I sort of got into this area is that, so I have a background in kinesiology and in movement sciences, and I went into research sort of straight out of my undergraduate career, and I connected the kinesiology and movement science piece with rehabilitation. So the area of healthcare focused on improving function and quality of life, primarily in adult populations. And so these are a couple of pictures from some of my graduate work, and I would say that the research I did at this time was, I would say, fairly sort of traditional neurophysiology, biomechanical type of research. So it was all lab-based. We had all kinds of interesting equipment with which we could measure 3D kinematics and kinetics and forces, and we put people on chairs and threw them around and measured their EEG activity, all sorts of cool things. And we had some patients that you can see on the right there, and we had a walker, and we instrument the walker so that we can track their activities throughout the day and all kinds of stuff. And all sorts of really sort of passionate, interesting research that we as researchers had a very clear vision of how we thought this could help people and make a difference in their daily lives. But we were based in a rehabilitation hospital, and when I would go out and talk to the physiotherapists and the clinicians there and talk about how exciting this work was and how we thought it would be very useful to them, they would get these sort of glazed looks when we would talk and just kind of go, lady, you have no idea what our world is like, and what it's going to take to get a stroke patient into that chair, or what it's going to take to get that walker out there in the real world, and how they're going to use that with their IVs and whatnot. So around this time, as I sort of got to the end of my graduate training, I sort of think I'm really passionate about, how this work can help prevent falls in older adults and how it can help improve stroke recovery. But it just felt a little bit far from the front lines where I wanted my work to have an impact. And sometimes it wasn't always clear the direction that we were taking. And sort of around this, so then I'm starting to have these thoughts of how do I want this research to go, and how can it inform and influence practice? And this is a picture of my grandma in Southern Ontario, and there's a funny story that goes around my family where. So then I graduate from school, and I had done this research around falls prevention and how postural control and how we stand and keep our balance can lead to preventing falls. And I graduate, I get my degree, I get a PhD, and my dad calls up my grandma and says, "Oh, good news, Katie finished her school, she's a doctor now, it's all great." And my grandma goes, "A doctor? I didn't know she went to medical school." And my dad says, no, PhD, research doctor. And my grandma says, "Oh, she can't help me." And I was like, "Are you kidding me? Of course we can. This is what we're doing, and this is what we're focused on. And yes, research can help people." And I was very passionate about that. Lo and behold, a couple years later, she fell, broke her hip, like many older adults do, especially when they get in their 80s. And sure enough, my family called me up and said, "Okay, well, you did the research on this. What should we do? What do we do now?" And then, of course, I had to sort of humbly step back and say, well, my research is very focused, and it's not really at this level, and we're studying young, healthy people, and, it could, in 20 years, have an impact. So sort of sure enough, it all started to kind of come full circle. And this is where sort of at this point in my career, as a fairly basic researcher, I made this very strategic shift to this idea of knowledge translation and how do we get research put into practice to lead my career. And I have sort of been, and when I started down that path, I thought, okay, I'm going to go learn about this and then take it back to my field. And the longer I'm in it, the more I see how much potential there is to apply to all different types of research, topic areas, groups, and what are some of the sort of outstanding questions that we still have. And so what happens now as the Director of Knowledge Translation at CHI, I get lots of questions like, okay, we want to translate. How do we do it? And I say, I don't know. This is a very young, very new field. So there's so many questions about how do we get people to use research. We're still studying these things. It's still a research discipline. It's still evolving. We definitely have sort of parallels that you would in clinical practice where people are wanting to do it and use it before we have good evidence around what to do. And so what I'm really sort of working on now is how do we balance this? How do I get these two together? So that's a little bit about me and how I got here, and you'll hear a little bit more about my research, where the topic of interest is probably not immediately related to you right now, but I think what you'll be able to see is how these methods could be applied. But before we get to that, let's stop and have a little sort of conversation for a minute around what exactly is knowledge translation. Have you guys come across this term much? What does it mean to you? What do you think when you hear it?
See it as, or part of it is getting knowledge that's gained from researchers out to other people so that it's not just silos of information. So whether that's systematic reviews or policy papers or information sessions, they have podcasts now about like reviewing specific papers and talking to authors and getting information out and stuff like that.
So getting information out, not just in the research community, to the users of research. Anything else? What else do you think or do you hear?
For an example, excuse me, sorry, we're looking at the lab that I worked at, was looking at knowledge plastics. So we found a bunch of gene mutations that may be markers or predictors of whether or not they'll develop leukemia. And so my research project itself was a translational, like bench to bedside translational research. So we created like a sequencing platform where you can feasibly sequence like 3,000 patients all at the same time with a panel that can look at all 25 genes. So that's making a project that will make make basic science research feasible on a clinical scale that's affordable enough.
And is anyone doing it? Or has the platform been adopted? Or
like probably going to take another 5 years or so, but it's still ongoing. Mm-hmm. So like it's just the idea of making it like reducing the costs and making it actually possible.
Right, for sure. Any other thoughts about what KT is?
I guess for me, the crux of it is we do lots of research and we do find out answers, but how do you make that information attainable, understandable, and useful? And sometimes what you might know theoretically or learn methodologically might not be relevant yet, but are the people who it could be relevant to hearing about it? Are you interacting with them to ask questions that are relevant to them that mean something? I guess it's more of that kind of a concept.
Is this something that, I don't know anything about clinical training right now, like does the term knowledge translation, does the idea of it, does it come up in your training? Is this something you've heard before? Yes?
For us, like it comes up as how do you interact with patients and share with them information that's relevant to them? Like that also it certainly is knowledge translation, but not necessarily in the context of the CIHR kind of.
For sure.
We had like grad rounds a few weeks ago that was on the learning house, trying to kind of explain those topics and how do you integrate them more.
Okay. So from my perspective, one of the things that is new and sort of challenging in this field is that because it's so new, the word is very hot right now. The word gets thrown around all the time. And people have different meanings and different uses for the same terms. And it does have a very specific meaning in the context of health research funding and in the context of health research. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do is start with sort of just getting people to come to a common understanding. Are we all talking about the same thing when we're using this term? Because there's all these different terms that you often hear about. Is it knowledge transfer? Is it knowledge mobilization? Is it translation? Is it implementation? And all the definitions we heard today are right. And this is what makes it sort of a bit challenging. So sort of truth be told, I don't actually like the term knowledge translation very much because it's such a huge term. It's so broad that all of these sort of valid components or constructs within it are valid, but people can be using the same term to talk about very different things. So what we advocate here at CHI, and someone alluded to this already, if we are going to all sort of use the term, so we recommend using the Canadian Institutes for Health Research definition of knowledge translation. Because we are in Canada, they are funding us, and actually this definition is now adopted around the world. So WHO has adopted it, NIDR, National Institute of Disability and Rehabilitation Research in the States. So this definition is probably one of the most common definitions out there. And so CIHR defines KT as a dynamic and iterative process that includes synthesis, dissemination, exchange, and ethically sound application of knowledge to improve the health of Canadians. And that's often the part that you see gets picked out. But the other component within it that the authors have emphasized to me that we shouldn't forget is that all of this takes place within this very complex system of interactions between researchers and knowledge users. And so we can't forget that. It is the interaction, it's back and forth. It's not sort of just research out. And so the CHR definition is a good one, but it's quite long and large and complex. And so when I said I don't actually find the KT term very helpful, we've spent some time in our unit really thinking about that term and what it means, and kind of displayed this definition pictorially, which really helps me. And so what it comes down to is KT, this definition, being the synthesis, exchange, dissemination, and application. It's really these sort of 4 components. And I find this definition very useful because as soon as someone says to me, okay, I want to do KT, and can you help me with KT? I say, well, what exactly are you looking for? And typically you're going to get an answer in one of these 4 categories. And from there, I can very quickly sort of distill down what aspect of KT they're talking about. And knowledge translation is actually a very Canadian term, which is fine. We should be proud of that. But different countries around the world use different terms. And in the States, they typically talk about dissemination and implementation as equivalent to what we use KT for. And I actually find that a more useful way of distinguishing it because those are the sort of 2 sort of big components that we often talk about. So if you get nothing else from today, if you can sort of always bring this picture back in your mind when you're talking about KT of these 4 components, you'll be further ahead than a lot of the established researchers out there. And so we talked about this already as well. And so if we think about this idea of KT and how does it all sort of come together, one of the other things that we're still working out as a field is what exactly is knowledge translation? Where does it begin and where does it end? And so typically, this is a figure that was put out in the United States several years ago, and it talks about these ideas of research death valleys, where you have evidence and where they sort of get caught in the continuum and have trouble moving forward. And so typically the 2 major death valleys are between the basic biomedical research and clinical science and knowledge, Valley 1. So that was the type of research example that I think Flora was sharing with us. But then we also have this second valley, which was where I was getting at with my question as well. Is anyone using it yet? How does it get adopted, or you move beyond the potential to actual use? That's the second valley of research. And so even within KT, there's sort of debate around, is KT just about the second valley research, or is it about Valley 1 or 2? And so different definitions emphasize different things. I think sort of understanding the potential for it to go either way is, again, what's going to be sort of helpful in us all communicating similarly about where it all can go. So my next question, why do we need knowledge translation? You've talked a little bit about sharing it with patients and how you're going to communicate with them. I'm going to answer this question with another question for you. So how long does it take health evidence to get into practice?
I think 17 years old would as a background.
17 years was quoted to you at Grand Rounds. Do you know where that came from? So yes, we love that statistic in KT. 17 years, like think about it. Like we had cell phones that we carry around in suitcases 17 years ago, and think how far we've come. And I had a Walkman and all sorts of, CD player 17 years ago. All these things have changed now. We can do a lot in 17 years. Did they talk at Grand Rounds about where the 17 years come from?
My guess would be drug trials, but I don't know.
Okay, so this is sort of a bit of a sidebar. So it came from an analysis several years old now. We should probably update it, but 17 years. So we're a victim of our own. We're a victim of our own statistic now. So this group, Ballas and Boren, did this analysis of how long it took original research basically to make it into medical textbooks. And they used that as their definition for how, if it was making it into your primary clinical training, how long it would take. That was their sort of indicator of how long it would get into practice. And so it's a fairly sort of crude analysis how they came up with it in terms of how long it takes to go from doing the research to publishing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Would love for someone to update this now. But just so you understand where that 17 years that you'll hear now over and over again, that's where that comes from. So 17 years is a long time. We can laugh at that.
What kind of research was it?
They were specifically looking at, I believe it was like cardiovascular care kind of thing, and how various sort of drugs, cardiovascular drugs, and the evidence behind them took to make it into the medical recommendation, textbook recommendations.
It'd be an interesting study to try to redo it, because even how textbooks are used now is so different. So what would be considered at that point being available on UpToDate?
Yes.
Or being available on Medline, or being quoted in policy? Like what would be, because I actually don't know how they would do that easily.
Yeah. That would be a fascinating project. Don't you need projects to do? Someone could do that as a project. Okay, we're gonna come up with our list of projects and call me when you...
17 years from now, you can finish it.
And so the 17 is a very sexy number, gets a lot of attention, but the meaning behind that is that in the interim, we know that there is a gap between the recommendations, the evidence behind what thou should be doing and what is actually happening. And so the quality of care gets sacrificed in that interim. And so this was a really interesting, another article that gets quoted quite a lot. This came from 2003, and they looked at the quality of healthcare delivered to adults in the United States. So essentially what this research group did was they did this sort of huge chart analysis. They looked at over 439 indicators in these charts of what they would define as good quality of healthcare with primary health care advisors. So did you have your blood pressure checked? Did you get asked about smoking cessation? Stuff like that. And if those were found in the chart, they would say, yes, that's good quality of care. So they looked at over 439 indicators in over 6,000 people in the United States. And what they found was that just over half of these indicators were being routinely administered and adopted in care. So just over half, like that's pretty low, right? And so obviously there's lots of reasons behind this, lots of factors influencing this. This is what KT tries to address in our research questions to figure out how do we get that number up. But at the end of the day, that's pretty significant. This is US data, but we know that in Canada we have similar types of issues. And I would say if you're first starting out in KT research, one of the first steps we typically will do is an analysis of the sort of current state. What is there an evidence to practice gap around a particular issue? So those could be sort of great projects that might be good for you guys. And so we could do those. There's many ways we could figure out those gaps, either through chart reviews, through surveys, self-report. There's lots sort of different ways of that. So I would say as a very sort of initial step, we could think about what kind of gaps between evidence and practice. So again, I know you're finding systematic reviews, so you're going to find a systematic review on a topic that hopefully gives you some guidance about what should be done. Comparing current practice to what the systematic review is saying could be a really nice topic. So next question for the group: who has a role in KT? Whose job is knowledge translation? Say that aloud. Everyone's. Yes, it is. And lots of people laugh at me when I say this, but it's true. And I always sort of tell myself, if this work was easy, someone would have done it and someone would have figured it out already. But it really does take all of these groups to come together. So a couple of years ago, I was involved in an editorial for a special implementation science-focused issue in pediatrics. And so they made this nice little illustration for us at the beginning. But if you think about all of these these people. It starts with the patients, the families, and their caregivers. We've talked about engaging with them. You also need your frontline healthcare providers, knowledge brokers. Have you guys heard of knowledge brokers? Is that discussed at all? It's sort of a new role or a new term that's sort of coming out, and these are individuals specifically tasked as their jobs with trying to build that bridge between the researchers and research users. And so how do we take the existing evidence and put it into forms or communicate with them?
I have a
So
question about whether they're specifically tasked with that, or it's like more of an informal role that someone takes on.
could be both. We have knowledge brokers employed here, but certainly there's evidence talking about how within a community, someone might be seen as an expert, sort of local champion, local leader might take on that role. But what is important about the sort of employment or the funding aspect of it is that people are sort of finally recognizing that like you need to dedicate serious resources to this kind of work. It's not the research production, it's not the care provision, but in order to bring the two closer together, that takes time and energy and resources. Certainly, we need the high-level buy-in at the policy level, at the administration level. We need sort of public buy-in. We're still sort of in like a political climate, so we need them to understand. Of course, we need the researchers to do all that. And so that's what, if as you move forward, so for your projects, probably you're going to pick a very sort of small, you're going to be starting, fairly small with this, but as you move forward in your career, thinking about having all of these partners together at the table when you're launching this stuff is really critical, and trying to do anything sort of in isolation is only going to get you so far. And that's where, again, speaking with my sort of researcher academic hat, that's very challenging for a lot of traditional researchers, because we're in the university, we're sort of separate from the real world, and so we're saying, I've got this great thing that I think needs to go somewhere, but just building those bridges and doing those networks and relationships is a lot of very unfamiliar work. So you guys in your positions will be sort of much more well-positioned for this kind of thinking. Yes?
So for a lot of things, in the case that there's information, it just hasn't been made available or people don't know. What happens if the information goes against what culturally, religiously, or otherwise people want to hear? So that's a good example. An easy example would be like safe injection sites. There's no shortage of evidence as to why safe injection sites serve a purpose and are useful and are important. But if it goes against the ideology of a previous government or of you can translate all you want, but you know what I mean? So is there a piece around knowledge translation that looks at that piece of the puzzle? Like, you have to want the knowledge and you want to be willing to do something with it.
Yeah.
It's not just about getting it and hearing it. Like, you might not like what you hear, but what do you do with it?
Right. And so I would say in some ways that's like the hardest part, right? There's certain aspects, there's certain types of evidence that are more easily adoptable and people are ready to do that. I would say in terms of the science of knowledge translation, advocating and getting sort of policymakers and decision makers to use evidence in their thinking is the least advanced in terms of our progress, because they have all of these factors. There's political factors, there's financial factors. The evidence may or may not sort of weigh into that at all, and so all we can, what I would sort of say to someone is, so all we can do is, on one hand, present the evidence. Sometimes what we can do is ask different research questions or complementary research questions, again, to sort of build up the case. But at the end of the day, how I can make a decision maker think that way, we're not there yet. So I actually spend most of my time thinking about how to influence practice at the individual provider level, which is a bit more of a manageable kind of unit. probably has less impact. I'm still sort of working and figuring out like how do you tackle whole health systems? How do you tackle political agencies that, turn over every 4 years? And so this is the challenging part. Like, it's not straightforward, and it doesn't necessarily like go in a sort of easy path, which again is why that sort of like relationship and partner building can be so huge. So sometimes all it takes is someone in the health system who really believes strongly in using evidence-informed decision-making, and so you can make a lot of headway with that particular person. If that person changes over, then you might be sort of set back, and that's out of our control. So, those are the kinds of things I don't know that the science or the evidence is ever going to help us through that. So how I to give you some sort of perspective, and I talked about this already a little bit. So KT is in an interesting place right now because we're trying to develop this science simultaneously with lots of people interested in practicing knowledge translation and just sort of doing it. And what I spend a lot of time thinking about is how do we move the two together? How can one inform the other? How can science inform the practice? How can the practice give us a bigger evidence base on which to synthesize and make conclusions to advance the science? And so what can, again, become sort of confusing is you have people who want to do it, you have people who want to study it. How do we sort of make sense of all of this? And so I've sort of thought about the idea of knowledge translation as a continuum. And on the one end of the continuum, we have this idea of sort of knowledge, common sense, KT practice. And so this, I would say, would be very sort of prominent with the rise of KT as a buzzword. Lots of people are hearing about it now. I get lots of calls like, great, I want to do KT. And they have no idea what that means or sort of what goes into it. So very kind of like well-meaning people, but have a lot of learning to do. And the term that the field sort of came up for this long ago was isaglia. So it seemed like a good idea at the time, knowledge translation. And again, it's really well intentioned, but you had no idea how many times people will come to me and they'll say, okay, I want to do this KT thing, and we're going to go a Twitter campaign, and we're going to make these handouts, and we're going to do a talk for these people. And they're just kind of like, it's the whole sort of kitchen sink approach, and you ask them why, and there's nothing sort of informing those decisions. And so those methods, those choices that they're doing, they may work, but there's no sort of theory or evidence kind of informing behind them. And we're starting to be able to point towards this growing evidence base that says, well, we're pretty sure that an infographic and a one-page handout is not going to change behavior. We do have evidence on that now. So if that's what you want to do, is that going to meet your goals? Things like that. So this is where I'm sort of at now with the support unit. Just in the course of today, what I'm hoping to nudge you from is this idea of this very sort of common sense based approach into being aware and understanding that there is this growing theory base and an evidence base that you can be looking to informing your decisions. And so for a lot of people, if that is where most people kind of operate in the KT space with, I'm good with that. The one paper that I gave you for today is what I tell people. If you only read one paper on knowledge translation, read that one. It gives a good sort of overview of where the field is at right now. Then, if you're sort of inspired, interested in these kinds of ideas, then I would say what most people can sort of go on to is the idea of what I call applied KT research. So this is thinking about the methods and the issues specific to a particular topic of interest. So this was how I got started. I got started in KT thinking about balance and rehabilitation and fall prevention. I wasn't necessarily advancing the methods, I was advancing my content area and the translation and uptake and implementation of data in my area without thinking about, well, is it the Twitter feed that works? Is it the infographic that works? And this is where, again, I think lots of people, and I'm always trying to get more researchers to do more, to ask more questions in this sphere, because even a basic researcher could start to ask some of these very sort of initial applied questions. And then there's the sort of few of us who are really interested in how to advance these sort of KT methods, but we want to sort of keep all of these in mind. And so this common sense KT practice, people sort of laugh at me, but again, this is sort of what it comes back to. I always like this cartoon, and this guy saying to this other guy, oh, your program was based on some sort of research-based theory. I think ours is based off of some rich guy's gut instinct. And again, like I said, if I had a nickel for every time, I would also be one of those rich guys. And there are lots of examples of this. Have you guys seen the pencil? No? Okay, good. This is a good one. So this was first reported on in the New York Times many years ago now, and it was a public health campaign addressed to school kids, and they made these pencils with, the message was a sort of drug cessation message. You're too cool to do drugs. And what happened was, as the children started to use the pencils, the message, the public health, knowledge trend, disseminating knowledge about drug avoidance changed. And it's funny, ha ha ha, but once you put these things out there, once you do these things, there can be significant long-term sort of impacts. And if I was the person who made those pencils, I would not want to be able to be found about this like almost 20 years later. So any questions, any thoughts about that sort of very general intro to this point? No? Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I want to talk about, we've touched on a couple of the components of KT already. I want to spend the next few minutes kind of breaking down those 4 components a bit, which again I think could help you in thinking about your potential projects and where you might sort of fit into one of these. So we talked about how we have synthesis, exchange, dissemination, and application, and those are you can pretty much put most of your sort of KT activities or tasks into one of these. So what exactly are we talking about? I'm going to jump and start with dissemination, because this is the one that is, virtually every researcher, anyone doing a research project needs to do dissemination to some extent. And so what we're referring to here is the active spread of a new knowledge or practice to our target audience using a planned strategy. And so another sort of buzzword that gets used with this is the idea of end of grant KT. CIHR talks about this a lot. And so dissemination, like I said, is important. Peer-reviewed publications, academic conferences, these, for virtually every researcher, are the sort of bread and butter of dissemination, and that's fine. The peer review process is really important. We never want to, we need that. That's our sort of quality control in research. And like I said, everyone will engage in that to some extent, but what knowledge translation as a field is sort of trying to promote is sort of moving beyond these kind of traditional dissemination activities. So what other types of dissemination do you guys see as potentially being relevant for a particular audience depending on the type of research you're doing? Have you seen other mechanisms?
Something other than the ones that you mentioned earlier.
Other than so for researchers, we would typically disseminate through peer-reviewed publications, academic meetings.
There's a podcast called The Skeptic's Guide to Emergency Medicine, I think. And so it's a guy who finds new publications that are interesting and does like a critical analysis of it and invites the researcher on to talk about it. And his goal is to reduce that knowledge translation time to 2 years.
That's very admirable. And so who would the target audience for that podcast
would be? Like emergency physicians.
Emergency physicians. Okay. So how else would you disseminate to physicians, to clinicians?
So when you're creating your design, you're including the decision makers or policymakers in the process, and you're more likely to have the outcomes included and be useful to them, so you're asking questions that are relevant to them.
Absolutely. The KT definition would put what you're saying as very important in a different category, which we'll get to in a second. Specifically around dissemination.
So like courses available.
Rounds, yes, for sure. Websites, yes. Are any of you?
Emails, like we get weekly emails from the AAP.
Do you read them?
I love reading them. And sometimes we have announcements or drug reps they come and sell
Yeah.
information.
Yeah, that's a very controversial way of disseminating, but for sure. So lots of examples of dissemination out there. What would be, if you think about all these examples, like what are the limitations of dissemination?
Finance.
Good, yes, for sure.
No one is receptive for the information. He's not reading his email.
If you don't read the email, right.
And depending on the mode, like if you're using more technology-based, then you might be missing an older generation of
Yeah.
target audience, or if you're using mailing stuff or home phone lines, like you might be missing a younger generation as well.
Yeah.
I think there's also a certain amount of like information overload that clinicians are dealing with, and so like it's super important for someone to like further their research and try and get to the endpoint. But at that endpoint, there's so many inputs; it can be hard to
Yes.
leave everything out.
Has anyone done anything different as a result of listening to a podcast or reading an email?
Does anyone else like New England Journal does those like 3-minute quick takes that are like those videos?
On Facebook?
Yeah, I love those things. They're golden. Those are super effective on me.
The number one sort of limitation of dissemination is, most of the evidence so far shows that like it doesn't actually change your behavior. It influences knowledge, it can influence your attitude, but the odds of a one-page handout having a lasting impact on your behavior are very, very small. And so again, when people are coming to me saying, oh, we want to do this, I'm saying like, hold your horses kind of thing. Like yes, maybe knowledge and awareness is all your budget will allow, is all your goal is, but we need to keep this in mind. We need to not sort of fly this education session sort of up the flagpole as having a huge lasting impact on behavior. We need to be aware of the limitations. Yeah.
Where do like order sets and clinical pathways as like an administrative piece fit into knowledge translation? Because that's one area that like I know we as a group don't have much like control over, but it actually changes what we do a lot.
Yes.
It's like, oh, there's like an asthma pathway, and like I'm more likely to think of the treatment when I read it on the asthma pathway and then consider it. And I know that someone has actually gone in to like think about the evidence for putting it on the pathway and all this stuff.
Right. So those, I don't know if anyone has synthesized the evidence on clinical pathways specifically, but those are the types of things that, yes, so we're going to get to that. Like that would be an application, right? That would be a way of implementing the data. So that would be potentially, I would hypothesize that something like a clinical pathway would have a lot more impact than an education session, because there is a plan, there's long-term, like it might be mandated by your health center. All of these things influence behavior sort of as well. So yeah, that would be the kind of thing that I could say to someone, oh, that sounds interesting to me. Now, the other thing is that I'm not saying that these dissemination examples, we don't know that they all don't work. That podcast sounds very cool, but is he evaluating it? Is he measuring the impact? This is the other thing that often happens with these dissemination activities is people just do them and then they sort of carry on, and they don't apply the same measurement, evaluation, or rigor to their KT as they do to the research that they created in the first place. And so again, we can potentially be putting in a lot of time and investment into these activities without knowing what they're doing or what is the impact of them. So that's the other sort of thing that I will say to people when they come to me wanting to do some sort of dissemination activity. I'm sort of stressing, okay, how are you measuring the impact of doing this? What are you looking for?
Flip side of that though, because you can put a lot of time and effort into measuring like a difference.
Yes.
When like actually like your effect is probably going to be the same if you measure it or don't measure it.
Well, if you were going to use budget, so then I would say, well, then how, like, what does it, do you, I would sort of put that back to like a financial question then, because you're going to spend time and money and resources. Like, is this a good investment? If you don't know whether something is a good investment, then why are you doing it in the first place? Which is I would use to challenge people.
KT project have to be measured in some way, or can you say like, they did it for this, it seemed to work, we're going to do it, but not measure it because that's going to take time and effort?
I would
do that with research, like if you think of it as like a different type of research, I mean at a certain point yes, but there's not enough evidence. Like if you, for example, if you're thinking of like asthma, and it's like, okay, we know that like, or this study shows that dexamethasone is good to get kids with asthma when they come in, right? Are you just gonna say like, okay, well we're gonna do that, but we're not gonna measure it because that study said it was okay?
Well, like, yeah, at a certain point, you would say that like, we're gonna stop measuring.
Yeah, at a certain point.
I think you guys are describing different things though. Like you're describing inputting a change in place and seeing if it has an effect.
Yes, but I think what she's saying is that if we're not going to study the knowledge translation, like we don't actually know which methods work. And so if you have to kind of consider it in the same way you would consider other research, if that makes sense.
I think I would say what I would love to be able to do is get to a point where we could do that, where I could say there's an established evidence base around podcasts or the effect of podcasts on physician behavior, and that there's an established clear evidence base that shows that, then we could get to a point where we don't have to measure it anymore. But we are not at that point yet, and my issue is that so many people are like sort of doing KT activities and they're not measuring what they're doing, and people just keep doing things without actually knowing what is the impact of doing them. So I would say, and this is like part of my message, is like I'm promoting what I would say gold standard knowledge translation is like we're not able to do KT yet. We still need to study it. Like it's so new and there's so little understanding about the impact of it that ideally I think everything needs to be turned into a research project. Now, not everyone is going to listen to me on that. Not everyone is going to do that. They're not going to devote that time and energy to doing that. I see that as a missed sort of opportunity. So for me, there is very little like KT practice versus KT research yet. Like I don't think that the evidence base is sort of strong enough yet. So what I'm constantly doing is going out to saying to people, we need an REB for that. We need an REB for that so that we can publish, and we need a rigorous evaluation plan so that we can publish it. And so like some of these things, like, they don't have to be complicated studies. Like, we're talking about quasi-experimental, like, pre-post designs, like, at this point, but, like, so few people are measuring these constructs that let's start with a pre-post study on the effect of a particular, podcast or whatnot. I keep using this example, but as a starting point. If it doesn't do anything, then we'll know we don't, need to compare it to anything. But if it sounds good, then we can start to sort of be a bit more sort of rigorous around that. And this is where it's a bit of a chicken and the egg, right? Like everyone wants to do it. No one wants to slow down with me and study it yet. So I would love to get to that point. And one day, I hate to say, I don't know, that might take longer than 17 years. But if everyone was measuring it and publishing it, then I could do a systematic review and a meta-analysis soon to be able to say with conviction, this works, this does not.
I feel like a piece of that too is there's a push now for, as you said, to include knowledge translation in your study design and what you create. But if you're actually including it, you're actually doing it, you actually have to do it. Like you can't just put out a pamphlet and say, well, I did KT, wave my flag and carry on, which I think is a big thing in recent years with knowledge translation.
Absolutely.
There's so many people who've done knowledge translation, but like, have they even kind of forget, like, then asked if it worked? Like,
yes.
Did they even to begin with? No. They stamped it and carried forward.
Yeah, and that is totally like a double-edged sword that we're kind of living right now, is that it's so hot that suddenly there's all this like pressure for everyone to be doing it, but people, established researchers, like there was no class on this in my graduate training. This was not a thing yet, right? So, a lot established researchers are learning these the lingo, frankly, and they're trying to get, so people are like getting really excited and promoting things that, are not always very rigorous or, good, so to speak. And that's totally like I call it the double-edged sword of KT right now. So I'm trying to promote like good KT and getting it at the ground up kind of thing. So synthesis is another aspect of knowledge translation that actually very few people sort of call this out as one of the sort of key aspects of KT, but we actually think of this as the sort of cornerstone. If we're talking about what kind of evidence we're looking for to go out and sort of try to get the health systems to uptake, we're looking at systematic review level data. Like, you are not going to be going out and trying to change the world on the results of a single study. That would also not be good KT. So that's the other thing we often have to temper sometimes, is a researcher might have a result from a single study and say, oh, this is huge, blah, blah, blah. Well, it's one study. Has it been replicated? Who is it appropriate for? We all will often have to sort of dial people back a bit as well to say, what is this sort of data appropriate before? And so I think of synthesis as a sort of applied KT research as well. So again, I think it's great you're thinking of topics. If you get interested in research, I think syntheses are really powerful. If you're looking for high impact publications, my reviews are way more uptake and hits and citations than my original research, sort of original quote unquote new studies. And they can be fairly low tech. So I often think, like, if you're working at the interface of sort of clinical practice, if you don't have a lab, anyone can, be doing research. Like, they're not sort of lab based. So they're very sort of powerful. And I know you've started to have you had some intro training into that today as well. So there's so much potential for systematic reviews. So don't give up on, don't sort of write those off either. The last two components of KT are where I start to get really excited. And again, for the general research population, this is where, researchers, this is sort of stretching more researchers out of their comfort zone. I think clinician scientists would be much more sort of comfortable here. And this piece is the idea of exchange. And so Suzanne, that's what you talked about as this is where we're actively engaging and interacting between the researchers and the research users. And so CIHR calls this integrated KT. And so it's really the process of getting your research user, whether that's your patient and family, whether that's getting a clinician, your health policymaker on your research team from the get-go. So thinking about KT as engaging your end user in your research question, so that every decision you make is of the most sort of relevance to them. And this is what I get the most excited about. So when I think about KT, for me, knowledge translation is about changing how we do research. It's not about just me sitting in my lab thinking about what I think is the next interesting question to do. It's about connecting with the clinicians who I want to partner with and saying, what are your questions? What do you need to know? In my experience, clinicians are looking for evidence to guide them, and often part of the gap is, as a researcher, I could say, well, you're not doing this you're not doing this practice that we've shown this intervention to be effective, and you can sort of put all the blame there. But often, clinicians are looking for answers, they're looking for guidance to support them, and no researcher is addressing this question. So it's often about fitting a square peg into a round hole. And so for me, this idea more than anything was really what sort of changed the path of my research questions from here's what I think is the next thing to do to being really sort of guided by my end user. And so again, this may not sound like earth-shattering to you guys because you're already sort of bringing in that clinical perspective, wearing that clinician scientist hat, you're already going to be sort of much more closely linked to this, but I think that sort of making the most of those opportunities and sort of really rolling with that is super powerful. And this is what I'm trying to get more sort of traditional researchers to do. But again, asking a bench researcher to go out and talk to patients and find out what does the patient want to know, it's terrifying. What if your whole lab is of no interest to a patient? Like, how do we bring those two together? That's scary. And so, again, not an easy problem, but that's one of the things we're sort of trying to sort of nudge people towards. And then that last bit, it's given equal weighting on this list, application or implementation, but this process where you actually get the knowledge put into practice is huge. Like, this is a whole sort of sphere into its own, and I'll show you a model in my last 5 minutes of sort of what it actually takes to do that. And so this paper that I gave you, Knowledge Translation of Research Findings, I would say has a great sort of summary of what the implementation evidence is. It hasn't been updated in a while. Again, we have our own sort of issues with that we could be sort of summarizing. But I think this will give you a good sort of starting point of like where you could go for more information. So let's, a couple of questions for you guys, just to sort of think about in our last few minutes or so. So you've heard about all these components. I've talked a lot about where there's lots of sort of potential. After hearing all that, I'm interested to hear from you which components of knowledge translation and research resonate most with you, and what do you think would sort of most closely align with your potential research interests, however sort of big or small they might be. Do any of them sort of jump out?
Application.
The application? Okay, when I show you the next slide of what it will take to do that, we'll come back to that.
I think the exchange piece is really interesting, especially in pediatrics. Like, we've had a number of sessions where we talk about how, because our like population of children who are like have illnesses and rare diseases, especially mental health specialties, is so small that the likelihood that you are doing research on your own patients, I think, creates like a really interesting like environment for like knowledge translation and exchange, because you get to like be the one who is like investigating these like new therapies, and then also like working with them, with like you and your patients, you and the patient's parents, you and your like section, in terms of like, okay, like hold on, we like tried this and like this group and they did much better compared to this one. And I think that's just really interesting. I see like lots of ways, and through like section rounds or grant rounds or academic rounds, where you can say like, we have this new idea for like when you use this immunosuppressant in like the product syndrome versus like this one. I think that's really interesting.
Cool. One of the things that I often hear is that like there are lots of groups who are doing integrated KT and doing that exchange piece very well without knowing that there's a term for it, or without knowing that CIHR is really interested in it. And if you knew what the evidence base and what some of the arguments for it were going, you could include that in your protocols and your research grants, and that's a selling feature that not everybody does. So I see sort of all sides of it. I see people like throwing out these terms who aren't necessarily doing them comprehensively or rigorously, and then I see other people who are like, oh, I'm doing that, I didn't even know that was a thing. And to those people I say, great, like use it, go get lots of money for it, like, because we yeah. Anybody else? Is this sort of like jumping out at anyone else? It's okay, we could let it sort of sit. I'll finish off. I'm like supposed to be done at 3, right, Celia? Okay. Okay, so we won't go too far into a research program, but this will just sort of give you another sort of tip of the iceberg. So for those of you interested in application and implementation, this is the sort of leading framework on how to actually get knowledge into action. Have you seen this? Have this come up before? Okay, so this is also Canadian and also really sort of popular and commonly used worldwide, and it's good. I like this framework a lot. I have found it to be like a roadmap, to essentially be like this sort of step-by-step process. And so what it really sort of what it is telling us is, once we move past our sort of very preliminary research questions where we're creating that new knowledge, and then we synthesize it down through systematic reviews. So your questions about clinical pathways earlier, that we would call that a knowledge tool or a product as a way to help you sort of use that information into action. So some people might say, okay, well, we've got the evidence, we made a systematic review, I've got that best practice guideline, therefore it should be used. The research process, the work is done. But what this knowledge to action framework tells us is, oh no, this is actually where the work begins. These are all of the things that we need to do to actually sort of get something used into practice. So we need to find out, we have our best practice guideline, we need to find out, is there a gap? What is actually happening? You know, in a perfect world, there wouldn't actually be an evidence to practice gap. Practice would be doing